Imagine giving 20 years of your life to one company, only to be told you're too expensive. That's exactly what happened to Robert Callahan, a 58-year-old senior systems engineer in Boston. For 2 decades, Robert had been the quiet architect behind Harbor Point Community's entire digital backbone. He was the man who built, line by line, the custom systems that managed 70 apartment complexes across 5 states. Yet one cold morning, he found himself sitting across from Ethan Cole. The new chief technology officer, young, polished, Ivy League educated, who had been with the company for less than a year. "Nothing personal," Ethan said with a smirk. "We can hire 3 junior engineers for your salary." Beside him sat Diane Reynolds from Human Resources, sliding across a manila folder containing Robert's severance package. 2 months' pay, a handshake, and the unspoken expectation that he would simply vanish. Robert didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even raise his voice. He carried his years of service out the door in a single cardboard box, while colleagues averted their eyes in fear that they might be next. But what Ethan and Diane failed to understand was that Robert wasn't just leaving a job behind, he was leaving with knowledge no one else possessed. And within weeks, Harbor Point would discover just how dangerous it was to underestimate the man they had dismissed. What Harbor Point's executives never bothered to learn was that Robert Callahan had been more than just another senior engineer sitting behind a desk. For 20 years, he had been the foundation of everything they took for granted. Back when Harbor Point was just a modest property group with a handful of apartment buildings in Massachusetts, Robert was hired by the founder, Harold Whitman, practical man who valued reliability over flashy resumes. Harold gave Robert one instruction: build us something solid, something that will last. And that's exactly what Robert did. Piece by piece, over late nights and weekends, he designed a custom management system that could handle everything: tenant applications, rent collection, maintenance scheduling, even background checks, long before competitors had thought of such integration. What began as a couple of desktop computers in a back office eventually grew into a digital network, supporting more than 70 complexes across 5 states. But Robert had built more than software. He had built resilience, hidden redundancies that kept the system running even when individual parts failed, security layers designed to protect tenant data as if it were his own, intricate pathways only he fully understood because Harbor Point's executives never invested in something as simple as a documentation team. Over the years, Robert had requested it again and again. "We need to train others. We need a paper trail. We need backup." Each time the answer was the same: too expensive. We'll get to it later. Later never came. So Robert quietly became the only living map to the empire he had constructed. He wasn't trying to make himself indispensable. It was simply the result of management's short-sightedness. But now, with Ethan Cole's decision to cast him aside in favor of cheaper graduates, that buried truth would surface. Robert's wife, Linda, had seen it coming. She had watched the new executives arrive with their buzzwords about cloud migration and cost optimization. Over dinner one evening, months before the termination, she had warned him, "They don't see your value, Bob. They see a salary line on a spreadsheet. You need to prepare yourself." Robert brushed it off back then. "They need me," he told her with quiet certainty. "No one else understands how this whole system fits together." Linda had shaken her head sadly. "That might be exactly why they'll try to push you out." Her words echoed in his mind the night he carried that cardboard box to his truck. Because Linda had been right. The young executives didn't want to depend on a man nearing 60. They wanted quick fixes, cheaper labor, and shiny PowerPoint slides. What they didn't realize was that the system Robert had built wasn't some off-the-shelf package you could hand over with a training manual. It was a living, breathing organism, and he was the only one who knew how to keep it alive. Sitting on his porch that evening, overlooking Boston Harbor with a glass of bourbon in his hand, Robert replayed the meeting in his mind. Ethan's smug tone, Diane's rehearsed sympathy, the silence of colleagues too afraid to meet his eyes. 20 years reduced to nothing personal. He felt the sting, but beneath it, something stronger took root: clarity. They thought they had replaced him. They thought anyone could step in and manage what he had spent 2 decades perfecting. But Robert knew the truth. They had cut away. The very anchor holding the company steady, and anchors, once gone, leave ships drifting into dangerous waters. Robert didn't need to wish them failure. He didn't need to plot revenge. Simply needed to do nothing. His time itself would reveal the difference between a man who builds systems to last and managers who only chase quarterly savings. Within weeks, that truth would come crashing. Down on Harbor Point, louder, messier, costlier than Ethan Cole or Diane Reynolds ever imagined. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Barely 2 weeks after Robert Callahan walked out of Harbor Point Communities for the last time, carefully balanced systems he had built began to unravel like a sweater snagged on a nail. The first sign came, quietly, a tenant payment portal that refused to load. For most renters, it was just a minor annoyance, but within hours the complaints multiplied. Families trying to pay rent online grew frustrated. Property managers were flooded with phone calls. By the next morning, the issue had grown into a full-blown outage inside Harbor Point's IT department. The 3 junior engineers Ethan Cole had so proudly hired stared at lines of Robert's code as if they were ancient hieroglyphics. To them, it made no sense. The redundancies, the safeguards. The way one module fed into another, it was like trying to decipher the wiring of a cathedral clock without ever having seen it work. Meanwhile, maintenance requests stacked up. Tenants who once submitted a request and saw it handled within hours now found their work orders stuck in digital limbo. A leaky pipe in Connecticut went unrepaired for 3 days. A broken elevator in New Jersey stranded senior residents on upper floors. Complaints echoed across 5 states. By the 3rd week, the automated billing system malfunctioned, double charging some renters while failing to bill others at all. For thousands of families, what had once been a seamless, invisible process turned into chaos. Property managers scrambled to reassure residents, but without Robert's guiding hand, the system simply buckled. That's when the calls to Robert began. First, it was Ethan himself, his voice sharp but strained on the voicemail. "Robert, we're experiencing some temporary difficulties with the portal. It would only take a few minutes of your time to walk the team through it. Call me back." Robert let the call go unanswered. The next day, Diane Reynolds from HR left a more careful message. "Robert, I hope you're doing well. We'd like to discuss a short consulting arrangement. It's a very generous compensation. Please call us." Generous. That was the word they chose, as if money could erase 20 years of dismissal. Robert sipped his coffee on the back porch, the sound of gulls circling over Boston Harbor filling the morning air, and smiled faintly. For once in his career, he wasn't rushing to put out their fires. But the calls didn't stop. By the end of the week, they multiplied. Ethan's polished tone slipped into desperation. "The system's been down all day. We've tried everything. Please, Robert, just a quick consultation." His former colleague, Alan Hughes, the database administrator he had mentored for over a decade, finally texted him, "Bob, it's chaos in here. They don't know what they're doing. Everything you warned them about is happening." Robert stared at the message for a long time. He cared about Alan. He cared about the tenants. But he also knew this collapse wasn't his to stop. He hadn't broken the system. They had. Choosing short-term savings over long-term stability. Harbor Point had sown the seeds of its own undoing. At home, Linda watched her husband closely. She knew the temptation he faced. To rush back in, to rescue the very people who had tossed him aside. But she also knew he had given too much of himself already. "Don't be their safety net, Bob," she reminded him gently one evening as they sat by the fire. "They need to learn what happens when you undervalue experience." Asterisk, her words steadied him. He realized that, for the first time in decades, the phone buzzing on the counter didn't control him. He had the power to choose, and he chose silence. And so, as Harbor Point's executives scrambled, as their young engineers floundered, as tenants grew angrier and investors grew nervous, Robert remained on his porch overlooking the harbor, calm and unhurried. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to gloat, because the cracks were widening on their own, and soon enough, the entire facade would come crashing down, showing everyone. just how costly it was to underestimate the man they had cast aside. Asterisk, the cracks had turned into chasms, and by the fourth week after Robert Callahan's departure, Harbor Point Communities was no longer hiding its panic. Asterisk, at first, the calls from Ethan Cole, the young CTO, carried an air of command like a man still clinging to authority. But with each passing day, his tone shifted. The first voicemail had been sharp. "Robert, the tenant portal's down. I'm sure you're busy, but this is urgent. Please call me back." By the second week, desperation seeped through. "Robert, the billing errors are escalating. I've had complaints from hundreds of tenants. I know you understand the system. Just a short consultation, 1 hour. We'll pay your rate." Robert let each message roll into silence. Then Diane Reynolds from HR tried. Her voice was careful, measured, as if speaking to someone she was finally beginning to respect. "Robert, the board has approved a consulting arrangement. $300 per hour, minimum 4 hours. We need your expertise. This isn't about long-term employment, just a temporary arrangement to stabilize things." Robert almost laughed at the irony. For years, every time he had asked for resources to create documentation, to train a team, to build safeguards, they had told him it was too expensive. Now, the same executives were begging him back for 10 times the cost they'd refused before. He declined without even saying the words. He simply didn't return the calls. But Harbor Point didn't stop. Within days, the offers doubled, $400, then $500 an hour. Ethan even appeared on Robert's doorstep one rainy evening, his suit rumpled, his polished charm nowhere to be found. His glasses slid down his nose as he spoke fast, as if afraid Robert would shut the door. "Robert, I wouldn't be here if it weren't critical. The entire system's on its knees. Payment processing is failing. Maintenance requests aren't reaching contractors. Tenants are furious. We'll pay whatever you ask. Just help us." Robert leaned against the doorframe, the porch light throwing long shadows across his face. For a moment, he remembered the box of belongings he had carried out of the office. 2 decades of loyalty reduced to a severance check. He remembered Ethan's smirk when he said 3 juniors could replace him, and then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I've moved on." The door closed softly, and with it, any chance of him being their savior. Inside, Linda handed him a cup of coffee. She had heard the entire exchange. "You did the right thing," she said gently. "If you step back in now, you'll only save the same people who never valued you." Robert nodded slowly. He realized she was right. He wasn't refusing out of spite. He was refusing out of self-respect. Meanwhile, messages from his old friend Alan Hughes kept arriving, painting a picture of chaos. "Bob, the consultants they hired don't understand the redundancies. They keep making it worse. The backups are corrupted. They can't even trace the errors back to the source. It's a disaster." For Robert, those updates weren't a source of joy. They were simply confirmation of what he had always known, that cutting corners comes with a cost. Harbor Point's leaders had thought experience was replaceable, that decades of knowledge could be substituted with fresh degrees and cheaper labor. Now they were paying the real price. Still, Robert didn't gloat. He didn't revel in their downfall. He spent his mornings on the porch watching the gulls circle over the harbor, his evenings sharing quiet dinners with Linda, and for the first time in years, his phone buzzing with frantic calls wasn't a burden, it was proof of his freedom. Because, in the end, Harbor Point wasn't just desperate for his help. They were desperate for the very thing they had thrown away: his wisdom, his care, his steady hand. And Robert knew, deep in his bones, that he would never sell those things back to them, not at any price. Just when Harbor Point's pleas were reaching their loudest pitch, Robert Callahan's phone buzzed with a very different kind of message. This time, it wasn't another desperate voicemail from Ethan Cole or Diane Reynolds. It was an email from Lawrence Mitchell, the CEO of a growing competitor called Summit Residential Systems, based out of Hartford. Lawrence's words were brief, but respectful. "Mr. Callahan, I followed your work at Harbor Point for years. Your system is legendary in our industry. If you're open to a conversation, I'd love to meet and discuss opportunities." Robert read the email twice, unsure whether to believe it. After weeks of being treated like a disposable expense, The tone of genuine admiration felt almost foreign. Linda, glancing over his shoulder, smiled softly. You should hear him out. What's the worst that could happen? Robert drove into downtown Hartford and met Lawrence at a quiet corner table in a coffee shop. Unlike Harbor Point's sleek boardrooms filled with buzzwords and polished smiles. This meeting began simply with a handshake and a steaming mug of black coffee. I'll be blunt, Lawrence said, stirring his cup. We tried the cheap route, hired 3 bright kids out of top schools. They built us something that looked shiny, but it collapsed the first time more than 100 users logged in. That's not what we need. We don't want gimmicks. We want something reliable, something that lasts. Robert listened quietly, letting the words sink in. For years, he had begged Harbor Point to prioritize stability over trends, documentation over shortcuts, and had been ignored. Now here was a man saying those very principles out loud. Lawrence leaned forward. We'd like you to come on board as chief systems architect. Full benefits. Stock options, and a salary 25% higher than what you were making. Before, Robert blinked. It was more than a generous offer, it was validation. But he couldn't help asking the question that had been gnawing at him. There are younger engineers out there. Cheaper ones. Doesn't that worry you? Lawrence chuckled. Ah! You sound like your old boss. No, Robert, cheap doesn't worry. Meet cheap fails worry me. Systems like yours don't just appear. They're crafted, tested, and refined over decades. That's the kind of wisdom you can't download from a textbook. For the first time in weeks, Robert felt something loosen in his chest. The bitterness, the humiliation of being told he was too expensive, it began to fade, replaced by the steady warmth of respect. By the time he left that coffee shop, Robert had accepted the offer. And when he called Linda on the drive home, there was no mistaking the relief in his voice. They don't just want me, Lynn. They want me to build it right from the ground up. With proper documentation, training, and a team that understands why it matters. She didn't need to see his face to know he was smiling. Sounds like someone finally understands your worth, she replied. In the weeks that followed, Robert began his new chapter at Summit. Instead of patching over old mistakes, he was designing a system the right way, clean, modular, and fully documented. He held training sessions with his new team, ensuring no single person carried the entire map in their head the way he once had. Alan Hughes soon joined him, along with others who had fled Harbor Point's crumbling IT department. One by one, they rebuilt not just a system, but a culture. Back at Harbor Point, chaos deepened. Their executives kept calling, offering Robert even higher consulting fees, begging for temporary help. But Robert no longer needed to answer, because for the first time in decades, he wasn't trying to hold a sinking ship together. He was charting a new course on a vessel built to last, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The first days at Summit Residential Systems were a breath of fresh air for Robert Callahan. Gone were the boardroom lectures about disruption and cost savings. Instead, he found himself surrounded by eager young engineers who listened, asked questions, and actually wanted to learn. For Robert, it was like rediscovering the reason he had gone into engineering in the first place, to build something that worked, something that lasted. But as Summit grew stronger, Harbor Point began to wither. The collapse of the old system had sent shockwaves through its IT department. Engineers were burning out under impossible pressure. Consultants shuffled in and out with no answers, and property managers grew angrier by the day. Robert heard pieces of it from his old friend Alan Hughes, the loyal database administrator. He had hired and mentored more than a decade ago. Alan had stayed behind at first, trying to hold the line. Then one afternoon, Robert's phone buzzed with a message from him. I can't do it anymore. They don't listen. They don't understand. I'm done. The very next week, Alan walked into Summit's Hartford office with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He looked weary, older than his years, but when he saw Robert, his shoulders finally relaxed. I should have followed you out the door the day they let you go, Alan admitted. But I guess I had to see the collapse with my own eyes before. I believed it. Robert welcomed him without hesitation. At Summit, Alan wasn't just another employee scrambling to patch holes. He became part of a team rebuilding the future, brick by brick, with the lessons they had all learned the hard Way and Allen wasn't the last. One by one, the engineers who had once worked under Robert at Harbor Point began making their way to Summit. Some left quietly, handing in resignations without fanfare. Others stormed out after heated arguments with Ethan Cole, who was by then drowning under the weight of his own bad decisions. Within 3 months, nearly half of Harbor Point's IT staff had defected, many of them directly into Robert's growing team. Each time a familiar face showed up at Summit, Robert felt both a twinge of sadness and a surge of pride. Sadness because he remembered how much potential Harbor Point had once held, how he had poured 20 years of his life into building it up. Pride because those same people now trusted him enough to follow him into this new chapter. Asterisk. And at Summit, things were different. Robert insisted on documentation from day one. Every line of code was logged, every process mapped, every safeguard explained. Weekly training sessions ensured that knowledge wasn't trapped in one person's mind. Mistakes weren't hidden out of fear, they were dissected, studied, turned into improvements. The culture shift was palpable. Engineers who had once worked in silence at Harbor Point now collaborated freely. Instead of executives waving off their concerns, leadership at Summit listened. When Robert asked for funding to expand server capacity, Lawrence Mitchell didn't say, "Too expensive." He said, "If it's necessary, we'll make it happen." The difference was night and day. Meanwhile, Harbor Point was becoming a ghost ship. Reports trickled back through Allen and others who still had friends inside, billing errors stretching into months, corrupted backups, clients furious at missed deadlines. The junior engineers Ethan had hired were long gone, unable to withstand the storm. Consultants rotated in like a revolving door, each charging astronomical fees but leaving the system more broken than before. Robert didn't take joy in those stories, but he couldn't ignore the truth either. Harbor Point's downfall wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of arrogance, of thinking experience could be replaced with something cheaper, shinier, and faster. Linda noticed the change in her husband. At dinner one evening, she set her hand over his and said softly, "You seem lighter these days, happier." Robert nodded. "'Cause for once, I'm not fighting uphill. I'm not patching mistakes someone else made. I'm building something. The right way, with people who believe in it." She smiled knowingly. That's all you ever wanted, and she was right. It wasn't revenge that satisfied Robert. It was the sight of a team working together. Systems running smoothly, and a culture that respected the people who built them. Harbor Point had underestimated the value of loyalty, of experience, of wisdom. Hard-earned, Summit embraced it. And as the weeks rolled on, Robert knew he wasn't just leading an exodus of talent. He was leading a quiet revolution, one that would soon reshape the entire industry. The true breaking point for Harbor Point communities didn't come from within their failing IT department. It came from outside, from the very clients whose trust had once fueled the company's growth. Chief among them was Westland Properties, a powerhouse in New England real estate. With more than 12,000 rental units under their management, Westland represented nearly 1/3 of Harbor Point's revenue. For years, Robert Callahan's custom-built system had been the quiet backbone of their success, processing rent payments on time, scheduling maintenance before issues became disasters, keeping records accurate to the penny. But without Robert, that backbone began to snap. By early summer, Westland's executives were flooded with complaints from tenants. Online rent payments wouldn't go through, leading to late fees and angry phone calls. Work orders vanished before reaching maintenance crews. Families were told their records were missing or corrupted, leaving them to prove they had paid rent in full. For Westland, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Their reputation, carefully built over decades, was unraveling because Harbor Point's system had collapsed. That was when Westland's CEO, Jeffrey Westland, picked up the phone not to call Harbor Point, but to call Summit Residential Systems. The conversation was direct. "You've lost confidence in Harbor Point," Jeffrey admitted. "Your name keeps coming up, Robert. We've heard you built the original infrastructure. If you and Summit can take us on, we're ready to move our entire portfolio." For a moment, Robert sat in stunned silence. 12,000 units. The scale alone would double Summit's operations overnight. It was the kind of opportunity that could catapult them into the top tier of the industry, but it was also a risk. Later that evening, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his wife Linda, sketching system diagrams on a legal pad. She watched. As he traced out arrows, servers, and timelines with the same focus she had seen 1,000 times before. "That look on your face," she teased softly. "It means you've already decided, doesn't it?" He smiled faintly. "It means I know it's possible. Hard, yes, but possible." The next morning, Robert met with Summit's CEO, Lawrence Mitchell, to discuss the offer. Lawrence's eyebrows rose as Robert laid out the scale of the project. 12,000 units across multiple states. That's ambitious. Robert didn't flinch. Ambitious, but achievable. "We'll need 3 more senior engineers, expanded server infrastructure, and at least 12 weeks to stage the migration. But if we do it, Summit won't just grow, we'll become the most trusted provider in the Northeast."
Although Lawrence leaned
back, studying Robert with a mixture of caution and admiration. "I notice your plan includes a significant documentation phase, 3 extra weeks at minimum. That's not something most companies prioritize." Robert's reply was firm. "It's non-negotiable." That's where Harbor Point failed. "We document everything from day one. Train the team on every single component. No more single points. A failure. If Summit takes Westland on, we do it the right way or we don't do it at all." For a long moment, the room was quiet. Then Lawrence nodded slowly. "All right, Robert, we'll do it your way." The decision was made. News of Westland's revolt spread quickly. At Harbor Point, panic turned to outright fear. Losing their largest client meant losing their financial lifeline. Ethan Cole and the board scrambled, throwing money at consultants, trying to patch together the fragments of a system they no longer understood, but it was too late. Westland had already signed a contract with Summit, and for Robert, the irony wasn't lost. The same executives who had dismissed him as too expensive were now watching the biggest client they ever had walk straight into his hands. Still, he didn't gloat. As he told Alan one evening over sandwiches in the break room, "This isn't about revenge. It's about doing the job right. Westland deserves a system that works in. We're going to give it to them." For Robert and Summit, the real work was just beginning. But for Harbor Point, the writing was on the wall. Without Westland, their empire was crumbling, and the very man they had cast aside was now building the future they could have had, if only they had listened. The day Westland Properties officially severed ties with Harbor Point Communities was the day the dam broke. For years, Harbor Point had strutted with the confidence of a company propped up by one of the largest real estate clients in New England. But once Westland walked away, the facade shattered overnight. Inside Harbor Point's headquarters in Boston, panic replaced pride. Reports came in daily of billing chaos, corrupted backups, and tenants furious over late fees or missing maintenance. Property managers were overwhelmed, drowning in calls from families who couldn't get simple problems fixed. One regional director admitted to Alan Hughes in a late-night text, "It feels like the whole house is on fire and no one knows where the exits are." Robert Callahan wasn't surprised when he heard Harbor Point systems had been built with care, but they required disciplines. Checklists followed, redundancies tested, backups performed in the right order. Without that, the whole thing was fragile. And Harbor Point had thrown out the one man who understood how all the gears fit together. The private equity firm that owned Harbor Point realized too late what had happened. They had brought in Ethan Cole to trim costs, make the company look leaner, and prepare it for a lucrative sale. On paper, cutting senior staff and talking about cloud transitions sounded impressive. But now, with Westland gone and systems in disarray, buyers weren't lining up. The valuation of the company plunged, dropping to less than a quarter of what it had been when Robert still sat in his corner office. It was in this climate of desperation that Summit Residential Systems, Robert's new home, made its move. Lawrence Mitchell, Summit's CEO, saw an opportunity too big to ignore. If Harbor Point was collapsing, why not buy them outright? At pennies on the dollar, Summit could acquire their properties, their contracts, and most importantly, the chance to bring Robert's old infrastructure under his new, carefully documented system. When Lawrence first brought the idea to Robert, he hesitated. The thought of going back, even indirectly, to the company that had discarded him was a bitter pill.
Right.
But Lawrence reassured him, "This isn't about going back. This is about building forward. You'll be leading the integration. We'll do it on your terms. Proper documentation, proper training, no shortcuts. We've learned that lesson." So Robert agreed. Months later, he found himself standing once again in the lobby of what used to be Harbor Point's headquarters. Only this time the sign above the glass doors read, "Summit Integrated Housing." The acquisition was complete. Harbor Point's empire had been absorbed, its leadership team dismissed, its proud name reduced to a footnote. Walking through those halls, Robert felt no satisfaction, no urge to smirk at the people who once averted their eyes as he carried out his box of belongings. Most of them were gone anyway. Ethan Cole had been forced out, his bold promises of cheap innovation exposed as hollow. Diane Reynolds had quietly resigned. Only a handful of former employees remained relieved to be under new management. In the server room, Robert paused. The machines blinked steadily, the same ones he had specified years earlier. Still humming despite the chaos that had swirled around them, Lawrence asked if he wanted to step inside. Robert shook his head. "No. We'll be migrating everything soon enough." At the first all-hands meeting, Lawrence introduced Robert as Chief Integration Officer. The man who would lead the technical transition, faces both familiar and new, turned toward him. Some looked embarrassed, some grateful, a few simply relieved. Robert didn't speak long. He told them the truth, that no one would be left behind because of cost-cutting, that they would build systems meant to last, and that respect for experience would guide every decision. The irony wasn't lost on the room. Harbor Point had once thrown away its anchor, believing they could sail faster without him. Now, under a new banner, that same anchor was the one holding the entire ship steady. For Robert, it wasn't revenge. It was redemption, the kind found not in punishing those who wronged you, but in proving your worth by building something better. And in that quiet moment, as he looked across the room at the people he would lead once more, Robert understood. Harbor Point's collapse wasn't his failure. It was their lesson. And it was one they had paid dearly to learn. The day Robert Callahan stood before the assembled staff of Summit Integrated Housing, the company born from Harbor Point's collapse, he felt a strange calm wash over him. It wasn't pride, it wasn't vengeance. It was something quieter, steadier, like a storm had finally passed. Leaving clear skies in its place, Lawrence Mitchell, Summit's CEO, introduced him warmly. "Many of you already know Robert. He built the systems that carried Harbor Point for nearly 2 decades. Now he'll be guiding us through integration, ensuring that we never repeat the mistakes of the past." The room erupted in polite applause, though Robert could see the mixture of emotions etched on the faces in front of him. Some looked ashamed, remembering how quickly they had looked away the day he was escorted out with his box of belongings. Others looked relieved, as though a captain had finally taken the wheel of a ship drifting in circles. And Futhos, who had followed him to Summit, met his gaze with quiet loyalty. When it was his turn to speak, Robert kept his words simple. "This isn't about going back, it's about moving forward. We're not here to gloat or dwell on the past. We're here to build something better than either company ever had before. And we'll do it the right way with documentation, training, and respect for every person's contribution. No one here will be left behind for the sake of cutting costs. That promise starts today." The irony hung in the air. Everyone knew it was those very cost-cutting measures that had destroyed Harbor Point, but Robert didn't need to say it out loud. The lesson was already written across the faces in the room. In the months that followed, Robert led the integration with a steady hand. He made sure every line of code was logged, every engineer trained, every process reviewed. No shortcuts. No silos. The culture began to change. People no longer whispered in fear of layoffs. They collaborated, asked questions, and shared knowledge. Openly, for the first time in years, the company wasn't operating on panic. It was operating on trust. Occasionally, Robert would receive a call or an email from old Harbor Point executives who had landed elsewhere. Some were polite apologies, others veiled attempts to justify their decisions. He read them, nodded quietly, and moved on. There was no need to reply.
What would be the point? Vindication didn't come from rubbing salt in wounds.
It came from watching a new generation thrive in the very environment he had always dreamed of creating one evening. As he left the office, Alan Hughes caught up with him. Alan had been promoted to lead database architect, a role he had grown into with confidence under Robert's mentorship. "You know," Alan said when they pushed you out, "I thought it was over for all of us. But now, this place feels alive. Feels like we're finally doing it the right way." Robert smiled. "That's because we are. And it's not just me, Alan. It's all of us, together." At home, Linda noticed the difference too. The heavy weariness that had clung to him during his final years at Harbor Point was gone. In its place was a quiet energy, the kind that comes from knowing your work matters. "You seem at peace," she said one night over dinner. Robert set down his glass and nodded. "Because I am. I don't need revenge. The work speaks for itself. It always has." And that was the truth. Harbor Point's downfall had never been his victory, it had been their lesson. His victory was in proving that experience and dedication, when respected, could create something that lasted. For Robert, vindication didn't come with triumphant speeches or dramatic showdowns. It came in the quiet satisfaction of watching systems run smoothly, of seeing young engineers grow into leaders, of knowing that this time the foundation would outlast him. Because in the end, real vindication isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right by building something better than what came before. 1 year after, Summit Integrated Housing absorbed Harbor Point. Robert Callahan found himself in a place he never imagined, at peace. The merger had been completed, the systems fully migrated, and for the first time in decades, Robert no longer carried the weight of keeping everything from falling apart. On a crisp autumn morning, he drove along the shoreline, the trees painted in shades of red and gold. The air was cool, the harbor calm. Pulling into the office, he felt no sense of dread, no knot in his stomach, just quiet gratitude. That afternoon, Summit's board of directors met with him and Lawrence Mitchell to review the future. Robert had proposed something bold, a technical education division inside the company, dedicated to training the next generation of engineers. It's not just coding, but the art of building systems that last, documented, resilient, and designed with care. The board approved it unanimously. When Lawrence shook his hand afterward, his words were simple. "Robert, what you've built here is remarkable. Just the technology, but the culture. You've given us something solid to stand on." For Robert, that was all the reward he needed. In the weeks that followed, he packed up his integration office, this time not in a cardboard box of loss, but with the satisfaction of transition. Colleagues stopped by to thank him, not with awkward glances, but with genuine gratitude. Even Justin Whitman, the son of Harbor Point's founder, visited him in the courtyard. "My father always said letting you go would be the biggest mistake this company could make. Turns out he was right." Robert didn't gloat. He simply nodded because he understood now that his story was never about proving people wrong. It was about proving that doing things right mattered. When the new division opened, Robert became its first director. He taught young engineers not just how to write code, but how to think about consequences, how shortcuts today could become disasters tomorrow, and how respect for details could protect thousands of families. In every class, he told them the same thing: what you build should outlast you. That's how you measure true success. For the first time since leaving Harbor Point, Robert felt his work wasn't just keeping systems alive, it was leaving behind a legacy. Robert's story is more than just about technology, it's about life. Too often people are undervalued because others mistake experience for expense. But the truth is, wisdom built over years cannot be replaced cheaply. And when we choose to keep building with care, with patience, and with integrity, our work becomes bigger than ourselves. It becomes a legacy. So, If you've ever felt overlooked or cast aside, remember Robert's journey. Sometimes the best response isn't to fight for a seat at the wrong table, but to build a better one elsewhere. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had someone underestimate your worth only to realize later how much you truly mattered? Share your story in the comments below. If this message touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Together, we can remind the world that real value, the kind that lasts, is never too expensive.